Thank you for joining me, artists, to make a landscape today. These are the supplies that you're going to need. Your canvas board, you're going to need a paintbrush, water, your little tray of paint that includes the white, the blue, and the black. Let's take a peek at the project description. We are going to be mixing different values of blue to create a layered landscape. And this is going to give our painting the illusion of having space. The learning targets for this project include being able to mix a gradient or a range of blue values from light to dark. I'm looking to see that your art has a clear foreground, middle ground, and background, that the objects appear larger and more detailed toward the front and smaller toward the back. You're going to be applying these paints with the goal of practicing that element of art called space. And as always, even though I'm providing a basic structure for how to do this project, please feel free to be creative and to also focus on completing each step with excellence. Let's go ahead and get started. Our first step is to begin with the background, and you'll notice even from this image that the background is the lightest value. So we're going to have to create the lightest tint of blue that we can. And so we're going to be starting with white, predominantly white, with just a tiny touch of blue. Now, theoretically, we could mix in the white cup, except that I'd like to reserve just a tiny bit for clouds in the end. And so I need a little bit of that pure white. So you may want to go ahead and put some of the white, most of the white, on your plate. And then you're gonna rinse out your brush and add just a tiny bit of blue. I'm gonna take just a corner here, just a teeny little bit, because at first I want this to be really light. Now, there is a bit of experimentation, and so you may discover, like me, well, that's kind of a little bit too light. So I'm gonna add just a little bit more. I'm getting just a very faint kind of sky blue. All right. Now, one thing that you need to decide is the orientation of your artwork. So you could do a landscape here in this format, or you could do a landscape in this format. It's entirely up to you how to do it. I think I might do mine this way. And so I'm going to be starting with the background. Now, to make things simple, I could just do the entire background with this light blue color. I do want to reserve some of the paint. So one thing that I could do is just add a little bit of water, and that will help this acrylic paint spread a little bit more over the surface. You'll notice that I'm not doing my painting strokes this way because that would kind of create some movement for your eye, and the air doesn't naturally flow up and down like that, so it'll feel wrong. So instead, I'm kind of just doing this how the wind would blow or my eyes would move over the surface of this landscape. Have the background painted, I'm going to start to create the next value of blue. And so I'm going to take the paint that I already mixed here. I have a little bit left, and I'm going to add some more blue. And this is going to make a darker value. You can see here, it still would be considered a tint of the pure hue of this blue. I want it just a little bit. I want it to contrast with the sky. So I'm going to add, I think, still a little bit more. Okay, I think this looks noticeably darker than that one. And I'm going to create just kind of a sloping type of mountain range in the back. Sometimes students will draw mountains almost like a little zigzag line of triangles. But unless you're somewhere like the Alps, you really don't see mountains that are quite that sharp. Typically, because of erosion, the mountain is softer looking. So I'm going to just do a soft range in the background. Now you could leave more sky if you wanted. Just going to do it over here and then kind of fill that in a little bit. And of course, I'm going to be layering the darker values on top. So I don't know that I necessarily need to do that color all the way down, but just kind of in the background here. All right, and then I'm going to repeat that process, adding a little bit more blue, getting a darker value, and then layering, and then I'll probably do it one more time before I really get into moving or into making what would be called a shade. So I'll show you my process and then I'll pause to show you how to mix a shade. Artists, now that I have these three tints, I'm going to move into the pure hue and then into some shades. So I've kind of got, you can see almost like a value scale happening here, the lightest blue to kind of that medium and then a little bit darker, and now just to the pure hue itself. And then we're going to go into adding the black. So I'm going to take this edge. I'm going to try and not contaminate this part of my paint. And I'm going to do the same thing, painting another layer with the pure hue. Now that we have our tints painted and also the pure hue, we're ready to move into the shades. Now, if you're like me and you've used quite a bit of your paint or your plate, you may consider just kind of wiping up a spot to make sure that you have a place for mixing your shades that is not going to be contaminated by the white or those lighter tints. So if you need to, go ahead and do that now. To make the shade, I'm going to take what remains of this pure blue here, and I'm going to put it on the plate. And then I'm going to add black. And eventually we may just paint directly out of the black cup, but we're going to need some of this darker value. Now, if I had been more careful, I could have been rinsing my brush out all along so that I didn't contaminate my paint, because now it's a little bit trickier. So that may be something that you want to be more careful about than I was. All right, so I've got my blue there. Now I'm going to get a touch of black from the edge. Whoops. And I'm going to start to mix a darker value. Now a little black goes a long way, so don't add all of it at once. This may have been even a little bit more than I should have. So I'm going to mix that in. I've got now almost like a navy version of this color, and I'm going to paint my next layer with that. I've done the background and the middle ground, I'm going to shift to this area in the front called the foreground. It is going to appear the most detailed because it's closest to the viewer, and it's also going to appear in this case as the darkest. So I'm going to be using the rest of my black mixed in with this shade of blue that I have here. And this is where I'm going to get a little more detailed. You'll see that I'm really envisioning this as a scene from Colorado, because I've looked off into the west and seen these kind of layers before. I hope you have too. And so I think I'm going to be adding some ponderosas or some pine trees, some maybe some craggy rocks or things like that that I imagine or I've actually seen on some hikes through the mountains. So this is where you're going to think about what you would like to include. It could be what I've done, or it could be something different that you'd like to put here in the foreground. I'll show you my process. I've completed my foreground, I wanted to talk to you about how to do the clouds. Now, something that you may have noticed is that I did change my water. I actually did this a couple different times. I also washed my hands a couple different times as I got dirty, which you may want to do. Another thing that didn't show up in the video, but I wanted to mention to you, is that I did use a hair dryer to dry a couple of these layers before I applied the next one. If you notice that as you're painting, that you're losing the distinction between those different values, it may be that you need to just let it dry more in between. So those are some tips that you may want to consider. All right, so now I am done with all of these colors. So I'm going to pull this white out that I reserved for the clouds. And you'll notice that I carefully clean my brush as well so that I don't contaminate the white as I paint. So for the clouds, they're going to appear larger toward the top. And as you move back toward the horizon line and they're further away, they're going to appear tinier. And the type of cloud that you could do, that you want to do, is up to you. You could do more puffy cumulus clouds. You could do those more wispy clouds that you might see in the winter, which are called cirrus. So it's up to you. I'm just going to add a few here toward the top, a few toward the horizon line, and call it good. So here we have the finished landscape. I hope that you enjoy making yours as much as I did. Remember that we're focusing on the use of space in art, and there's different ways to create that illusion. We tried having a clear background, middle ground, and foreground. We used overlapping, so objects look realistic and look like they're in front of each other or behind each other. And then we also used scale. So objects that are close up appear very large, and then as you go back, they appear smaller. So I will look forward to seeing your amazing landscapes.